I woke up expecting the usual peaceful morning on my farm, the kind where you can hear the birds chirping, feel the crisp air, and sip your coffee while watching the sun rise over endless fields. Instead, I was met with the sound of metal scraping against gravel, followed by a low, rumbling thud. My gut instantly told me something was wrong. I stepped out onto my porch, and there it was, a massive speed bump, right in the middle of my farm's main road. Not just a small bump. This thing looked like it belonged on a racetrack, built up with fresh asphalt, and sticking out like an eyesore against my dirt path. My stomach churned as I realized who must have done it. Karen. My next-door neighbor wasn't just a nuisance. She was the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood. She didn't own the land. She didn't have any legal authority, but she acted like she ran the entire area. If someone left their trash cans out for too long, Karen had something to say. If someone's mailbox didn't match her preferred aesthetic, they got a nasty letter in the mail. And now, somehow, she had decided that my farm road needed a speed bump. I marched down the path, my boots kicking up dust, already feeling my blood pressure rising. As I got closer, I saw Karen standing there, hands on her hips, admiring her handiwork like she had just painted the Sistine Chapel. A couple of men in neon vests, contractors, probably, were loading up their tools into a truck. My heart pounded. How in the world did she pull this off? Before I could say a word, Karen turned to me with that smug smile she always wore when she thought she had won. "Oh, good morning. I was just about to let you know. I had this installed for the safety of our community." I stared at her, trying to keep my voice steady. "Karen, this is my farm. My private road. What the hell is this?" She sighed dramatically, as if I was a child throwing a tantrum over spilled milk. "Well, I've seen the way trucks speed down this path. You know, big farm vehicles and all. It's a hazard. I have grandkids who visit, and I can't have them at risk because of reckless driving." Reckless driving? On my own farm? The sheer audacity left me speechless for a second. I took a deep breath, reminding myself not to let her get to me. "Karen, this is my land. You don't get to make decisions about it. And this, I motioned at the lump of asphalt running my road, is illegal." She waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be dramatic. It's just a little bump. If anything, you should be thanking me." I clenched my fists. She wasn't just entitled, she was delusional. "Who gave you permission to do this?" Karen's smile faltered just for a moment, but she quickly covered it up. "Oh, I spoke to the county about it." That was a lie. I knew because I own this land. If the county wanted to do anything here, I would be the first to know. She was bluffing, banking on the idea that I wouldn't fight back. I took another deep breath, trying to think rationally. I could tear this thing out myself. I had a tractor, tools, and plenty of manpower to get it done. But something told me Karen wouldn't let it slide that easily. No, she'd probably call the cops, spin some ridiculous story about me destroying public property, and make my life miserable. I needed to play this smart. So, instead of arguing, I forced a smile. "All right, Karen, you want a speed bump? Fine." Her eyes flickered with triumph, like she had just won some kind of power battle. "Glad you understand. Safety first, after all." I nodded. "Of course. But just so you know, since this is my land, I have the right to modify it however I see fit." She barely heard me. She was already turning, heading back toward her house with that self-satisfied strut of hers, probably thinking she had put me in my place. She had no idea what was coming next. I walked back toward my barn, my mind racing. If Karen wanted to play dirty, I was about to teach her a lesson she'd never forget. Karen had no idea what she had just done. As I walked back toward my barn, my mind was already calculating my next move. She thought she could get away with dumping a speed bump on my property, acting like she owned the place. But if she wanted to play dirty, I was about to show her just how badly she had messed up. I wasn't going to just remove the speed bump. No, that would be too easy. I needed something better, something that would make sure she regretted ever setting foot on my land. I spent the rest of the morning making calls, reaching out to a few friends who owed me favors. By noon, I had everything in place. I stood at the edge of my farm road, watching Karen from a distance as she pranced around her yard, completely unaware of what was coming. The first step was to make sure she had no way of reversing her decision. I contacted the county office, knowing full well they had never approved any roadwork on my land. After a few minutes on the phone, I had what I needed, a formal confirmation that no permits had been issued for any modifications to my property. That meant Karen had acted completely on her own. With that in hand, I submitted a formal complaint against her for illegal construction on private property, ensuring the county would investigate. That alone would be enough to give her a headache, but I wasn't stopping there. The second step was using her own stupidity against her. Karen had no idea what kind of road she had tampered with. My farm path wasn't just any dirt road. It was an active service road that was used by delivery trucks, farm equipment, and workers who helped with harvesting. The biggest mistake she made was placing an obstruction on a road that carried heavy machinery. That meant she had just created a hazard for vehicles that weighed several tons. And I knew exactly how to turn that into a disaster for her. That evening, I made sure to spread the word around town. I let every local farmer, trucker, and worker know about the new obstruction on my property. I made it clear that I wasn't responsible for any damages, and if their trucks got stuck or damaged because of it, they should contact the HOA, or better yet, Karen herself. Word traveled fast, and by the next morning, my plan was already in motion. The first truck arrived just as the sun was rising, a massive supply truck carrying feed for my livestock. The driver, a longtime friend of mine, took one look at the speed bump and laughed. Then, just as planned, he drove straight over it at full speed. The sound of metal scraping against asphalt echoed through the farm as the truck bottomed out, its heavy undercarriage smashing against the raised bump. Sparks flew, and for a second, I thought the whole thing might break apart right then and there. The driver hit the brakes, his tires skidding in the dirt, and the truck came to a full stop right in the middle of the road, completely stuck. That's when Karen came running out of her house, her face turning red as she saw what had happened. She looked like she was about to explode. I stood back, watching as she waved her arms like a madwoman, shouting at the driver. She tried to tell him that he shouldn't have been speeding, but he just laughed in her face. "Lady, this is a working farm road. You can't just slap a speed bump in the middle of it." She turned to me, eyes blazing, demanding that I fix the problem immediately. But I just smiled. I told her that since she had the brilliant idea to install a speed bump, she would have to figure out how to remove it. She looked like she was about to say something, but before she could, another truck pulled up, this time an even bigger one. Within the next hour, there were 3 more trucks backed up on the road, each one honking loudly, frustrated that they couldn't get through. Drivers were getting out, shaking their heads, pointing at the mess Karen had created. A few neighbors started gathering around, watching the chaos unfold, whispering among themselves. Karen's perfect little world was falling apart, and I could tell she was starting to panic. That's when the real fun began. Because of the blockage, several of my deliveries were delayed, which meant lost money. That gave me the perfect excuse to send Karen the bill for the damages. I handed her a neatly printed invoice for the total cost of repairs, equipment damage, and lost labor time, adding up to a hefty sum. She stared at it like she couldn't believe her eyes. She stammered, saying she wasn't responsible. That was my farm, but I cut her off. I reminded her that she had built it herself, without permission, and now she was going to pay for it. But even that wasn't enough. As she fumed, struggling to argue her way out of it, I pulled out my final card, the county notice. I told her that an official inspection was already scheduled, and if the bump wasn't removed within 24 hours, she would be facing a hefty fine for illegal construction. Her face turned pale. She knew she was trapped. She had no choice but to fix the mess she had made. That night, under the dim glow of streetlights, Karen stood outside with a jackhammer, struggling to break apart the very speed bump she had proudly installed. The irony was delicious. Every few minutes, I would glance outside, sipping my coffee, watching as she sweated and cursed under her breath, chipping away at the hard asphalt. A few neighbors even came out to watch, laughing quietly, enjoying the show. By the time morning came, the speed bump was completely gone, leaving only a cracked, uneven patch of dirt where it once stood. But just when Karen thought her nightmare was over, the real disaster struck. Something she never saw coming, something that would make her regret ever stepping onto my farm. Karen thought she had escaped the worst of it after tearing out the speed bump with her own hands, but she had no idea that her problems were only just beginning. She had spent the entire night sweating under the dim streetlights, using a jackhammer to break apart the very thing she had forced onto my land. By morning, the road was back to how it was before, at least on the surface. But her troubles were far from over. The county inspector arrived just before noon, clipboard in hand, wearing a no-nonsense expression as he examined the site. I stood back, arms crossed, watching as Karen fidgeted nervously, trying to explain herself. She lied, of course, saying it was a temporary road improvement that she had meant to remove all along. The inspector didn't buy it. He pointed out that not only was her construction illegal, but she had also damaged a working farm road, which fell under agricultural zoning protections. That meant she wasn't just dealing with a simple fine. She had violated state property laws, and she was about to find out what that meant. Karen's mouth fell open as the inspector handed her a notice informing her that she was under official investigation for unauthorized land modification. Since my road was part of a registered agricultural property, the county took such infractions very seriously. They weren't just fining her. They were holding her financially responsible for any road damage, any safety concerns, and any interference she had caused with my farm operations. And since my deliveries had been blocked because of her mess, the total bill was in the thousands. Karen's face turned pale as she stammered, trying to argue, but the inspector wasn't interested. He simply noted that a formal hearing would determine the penalties, and if she failed to pay up, she could face a lawsuit or even a property lien. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head as she realized how badly she had screwed up. But that was just the beginning. I had done my homework, and I knew something Karen didn't know. Her property had been built on land with an old drainage system running underneath it. Normally, that wouldn't be a problem, except for one little detail. Karen's reckless construction had compacted the soil near my property's runoff area, blocking the natural drainage flow that had been in place for years. That meant the next time it rained, the water wouldn't flow properly. It would pool up and flood the lowest area nearby. And that lowest area? Karen's front yard. For the next few days, I watched the weather forecast like a hawk, waiting for the right moment. And then it came. A massive thunderstorm warning was issued for the county, predicting heavy rain for the entire weekend. As the dark clouds rolled in, I could barely contain my anticipation. Karen, still dealing with the fallout from the county investigation, had no clue what was about to happen. The rain started slow at first, just a drizzle, but by nightfall, it was a full-blown downpour. Water rushed down from my land as it always did, but this time with the natural path blocked by Karen's failed construction project. It had nowhere to go. It overflowed into her front yard, turning it into a muddy swamp within hours. By morning, Karen's once pristine lawn looked like a disaster zone. Water had pooled so high that her driveway was completely flooded, and her flower beds had washed away down the street. The best part? Her garage had been hit the hardest. The water had seeped inside, soaking everything in its path. Boxes, furniture, decorations, ruined. And since this was technically a drainage issue caused by her own actions, her insurance wouldn't cover it. I stood at the edge of my property, pretending to inspect my fence while secretly enjoying the sight of Karen wading through her flooded yard, desperately trying to push water away with a broom. It was useless, of course. The damage was done. She must have known I was watching because she suddenly stormed toward me, soaking wet, covered in mud, looking like a drenched, angry raccoon. She opened her mouth, probably ready to scream at me, but before she could get a single word out, a county truck pulled up. The inspector stepped out, looked at her flooded property, then turned back to me and simply asked if my farm had suffered any damage. I shook my head and told him everything on my land was fine. He nodded and turned to Karen, expression unreadable, before pulling out another clipboard. That's when I saw the real panic set in her eyes. Karen wasn't just dealing with a fine anymore. She had altered a legally protected drainage flow, which was a serious environmental violation. Since my farm was legally classified under agricultural land use, it had state protections against any modifications that could affect its natural irrigation. The inspector told her in the calmest voice possible, that she would be facing thousands of dollars in environmental repair costs, along with potential legal action if she failed to restore the drainage properly. Karen looked like she was about to pass out. Over the next week, she tried everything to get out of it. She argued, filed complaints, even tried to get a lawyer involved. But the county didn't budge. The evidence was crystal clear. She had tampered with land she didn't own, built something illegally, and then caused a flood by messing with nature itself. It was a legal nightmare, and she had nobody to blame but herself. She ended up having to hire an expensive excavation crew to fix the damage, restore the drainage system, and pay out thousands in fines. By the time it was all over, her front yard was a muddy mess, her wallet was significantly lighter, and her reputation in the neighborhood was completely destroyed. Karen, the woman who had once walked around like she owned the entire street, was now the laughingstock of the neighborhood. People whispered about her whenever she passed, and a few neighbors even started calling her the queen of the swamp behind her back. She stopped strutting around, stopped harassing people over their mailboxes and trash cans. It was like she had shrunk, her confidence completely shattered. And I went back to enjoying my peaceful farm life, knowing that she would never, ever try to mess with me again. One evening, as I sat on my porch, sipping my coffee, I saw Karen step outside. She looked around, saw me watching, then quickly turned and went back inside. No more smug looks. No more condescending speeches. Just a quiet retreat. That was the real victory. She had finally learned the hard way that messing with the wrong person has consequences. And for the first time in years, I could truly say that peace had returned to my farm.